When disaster strikes, what truly matters is not what we lose, but what we still have left. This is the powerful story of Linda and Quang, whose home was swept away by a devastating flood. From the ruins, they built a fragile tent, clinging to one another as their only source of warmth and hope. Through tears and despair, they discovered that survival and love are stronger than any storm. Their journey reminds us that even in destruction, new beginnings are possible. Subscribe now and join us as we follow their moving story of resilience and love. The storm came like a thief in the night, swift and merciless. And before Linda and Quang could truly comprehend its fury, the river had already swelled beyond its banks. What once had been a calm stream that nourished the land turned into a roaring beast, carrying with it logs, branches, and the broken remnants of other people's lives. Within moments, the peaceful little home they had built together, planks of wood lovingly nailed, a roof patched with care, walls filled with memories, was reduced to nothing more than fragments swept away by the relentless current. Linda stood frozen at first, her bare feet sinking into the mud, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched the water invade their yard, rising with terrifying speed. She could almost hear the echoes of laughter that used to fill those walls, as if mocking her now in the silence that followed the destruction. Quang rushed to her side, his hands gripping her shoulders, urging her to move. "We have to get to higher ground," he shouted, above the roar of the flood, his voice hoarse but steady. But Linda's gaze lingered on the sight of their home collapsing under the weight of water, each crash of timber echoing like a cruel reminder that nothing was safe anymore. She thought of the evenings they had spent cooking simple meals together, the mornings when sunlight spilled through their window and warmed the bed they shared. Those simple joys had been ripped away in the span of minutes. Tears blurred her vision, mingling with the cold rain pelting against her face, and so she could no longer distinguish between grief and the storm itself. By the time they scrambled to safety, drenched and shivering, the house was gone, completely swallowed by the floodwaters, as if it had never existed at all. What remained was a scattering of debris drifting downstream, a chair leg, a piece of corrugated roof, a wooden beam that once held up their kitchen. The land where their home had stood was unrecognizable, a landscape scarred by mud and ruin. Linda sank to her knees, her sobs carried away by the howling wind. In that moment, she felt stripped of everything: her home, her security, the very roots she had planted in this soil. Quang stood beside her in silence, his fist clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with the weight of helplessness. He wanted to be strong for her, to tell her that they would rebuild, but his own heart ached as he looked at the devastation. The little home had been more than just shelter. It was a testament to their hard work, their shared dreams, and their love. Watching it vanish so ruthlessly left him hollow, like a tree uprooted in the storm. Yet, as he glanced at Linda, trembling and broken before him, a surge of determination flickered. The flood could steal their home, but it could not steal their will to live, nor the bond that had carried them through countless hardships before. For Linda, the world felt as though it had collapsed with the house, the weight of despair pressing heavily on her chest. Yet, beneath her grief, there was also a faint, fragile awareness that they were still alive. The storm had not claimed them, not yet. That tiny spark, though faint, held a promise. As long as they breathed, as long as they had each other, there was still a way forward. And though she wept into the rain, some part of her clung to that promise, unwilling to let go. The rain finally eased into a steady drizzle, but the night felt colder than ever. Linda and Quang wandered back down the muddy path once the raging water had receded, their steps heavy, their clothes still clinging to their skin. What had once been their home was now nothing more than a scar in the earth, bare ground smeared with silt and littered with the broken remnants of their life together. The sight tore at Linda's heart, but Quang held her hand firmly, grounding her, silently reminding her that they still had each other. With no shelter left and the air biting against their damp bodies, they began scavenging among the wreckage, gathering whatever could be salvaged. A few bent nails, a torn sheet of canvas, and some bamboo poles carried down from higher ground, these became their tools of survival. Under the dim light of a lantern salvaged from the debris, they worked side by side, driven not by strength, but by sheer necessity. Quang hammered stakes into the muddy ground, his hands trembling from exhaustion, but refusing to stop. Linda unfolded the torn canvas, fastening it as best she could with strips of cloth ripped from her soaked skirt. Each makeshift knot, each shaky tie was an act of defiance against despair. Their shelter was nothing more than a flimsy tent, barely enough to keep out the chill of the night air. But to them, it was a small victory, a fragile bubble of safety carved from ruin. When the tent finally stood, crooked but standing, they crawled inside and collapsed against the cold earth. The sound of rain dripping through the patched holes was a cruel reminder of how much they had lost. Linda curled into herself, her body shaking, not just from the cold, but from the ache of grief still lodged deep within her chest. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the distant gurgle of floodwater and the occasional crack of branches giving way outside. Quang reached for her hand, his grip warm despite the chill. He turned to her, his voice low and steady, though his throat was raw with unshed tears. "Linda," he whispered, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "We lost the house, yes, but listen to me. We didn't lose everything. We're still here. We're alive. That means we can rebuild." His words trembled with emotion, but there was still beneath them a resilience born not from certainty, but from love. Linda stared at him through tear-filled eyes, her lips quivering as though searching for the right reply. Then, with a sob, she buried her face against his chest, her tears soaking into the fabric of his shirt. "I don't care about the walls or the roof anymore. As long as you're here, as long as we're alive, maybe that's enough." Quang's arms tightened around her, and in that embrace, both of them found a flicker of strength that neither could summon alone. The storm had taken their possessions, their home, their comfort, but it had not taken the bond that kept them standing. They sat there in the fragile shelter, hearts pressed together, drawing warmth not from blankets or fire, but from the sheer force of knowing they still had each other. Outside, the night carried the smell of wet earth and ruin, yet inside their little tent, a different truth was beginning to take root. The storm had stripped them bare, but in its wake, it had left the seed of resilience. The house could be built again. The fields could be replanted. Their lives could begin anew. And as Linda lifted her head, meeting Quang's gaze through the dim lantern glow, she saw not just the sorrow of loss, but the quiet, unyielding promise of a future they would rebuild together. Morning arrived quietly, veiled in mist that lingered over the broken land. The air was heavy with the smell of mud and damp wood, yet for the first time since the flood, the sky showed a pale hint of blue. Linda and Quang stepped out of their makeshift tent, their limbs stiff and aching from a night spent on the cold earth. They stood side by side in silence, staring at the landscape that had once been their home. What they saw was devastation: fallen trees, ruined fields, scattered fragments of other people's lives. But beneath the ruin was also the undeniable truth: they were still alive. And that, more than anything, was reason to keep going. Linda drew a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs. The tears that had come so easily the night before no longer fell. Her eyes were red and swollen, yet there was a new clarity in them, a quiet acceptance that grief alone would not change what had been lost. She turned to Quang, who stood with his arms folded across his chest, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though daring the world to challenge him again. For a moment, Linda simply studied him: the set of his jaw, the strength in his weary stance, the faint lines of fatigue on his face. He was tired, just as she was, but in his eyes burned something stronger than despair: determination. Without thinking, she slipped her hand into his. Quang glanced down at her, and a small smile broke through his otherwise solemn face. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of survival, of resilience. And in that fleeting moment, both of them understood. Tears had carried them through the night, but now it was time to stand and face what lay ahead. "Do you realize how lucky we are?" Quang asked softly, his voice rough but steady. "The house is gone, yes. Everything we built is gone, but we're here. We have each other. As long as we're breathing, we can start again." Linda swallowed hard, nodding. "I was so afraid yesterday, afraid that we'd lose everything forever. But now," she paused, glancing at the small tent they had built from scraps. Fragile, imperfect, but standing. "Now I see that what matters most didn't wash away. It's still here, with us." Quang tightened his grip on her hand, and for the first time since the flood, Linda felt the corners of her lips curve into a faint smile. It surprised her that her body still remembered how to smile after such a night, but it was real, soft, trembling, and filled with gratitude. Quang smiled back, and in that simple exchange, the heaviness in their hearts began to lift. They sat together on a fallen log, watching the morning sun slowly break through the mist. The world around them was scarred, but the light revealed something else too: possibility. Where others might only see ruin, Linda and Quang began to imagine what could be rebuilt. A new house, stronger than before, new crops to replace what had been destroyed, a new chapter in their lives that would carry the memory of this trial, but also the promise of resilience. The storm had stripped them bare, but in doing so, it had revealed the essence of what truly mattered. Not walls or possessions, not even the familiar comforts of the past, but the simple, extraordinary fact that they had survived together. And as they sat there, smiling through the ache of loss, Linda and Quang realized that survival itself was the foundation upon which they would rebuild their lives. The flood had taken much, but it had not taken their love, their will, or their hope. With those still intact, there was nothing the two of them could not endure. And as the sun rose higher, burning away the last of the mist, they both knew that the future, though uncertain, was theirs to claim, hand in hand.
Hello, xin chào tất cả các khán giả của kênh Lý Tử Nina Review. Rất vui vì ngày hôm nay lại gặp lại các bạn trong tập phim ngày hôm nay. Trong tập phim ngày hôm nay thì vì Việt Nam vừa trải qua trận lũ lụt kinh hoàng ở khu vực miền núi phía Bắc, nên trang trại của Nina cũng bị ảnh hưởng, khiến cho căn nhà của cô đang ở đã bị lũ quét làm sập hoàn toàn. Quang và Nina và mẹ của Quang rất là buồn và cũng đã động viên Linda, và cả ba người đang có ý định là sẽ cùng nhau giúp Linda dựng lại một căn nhà mới. Trong lúc chưa có căn nhà mới thì Linda sẽ ở tạm một căn lều do Quang dựng tạm lên. Vậy liệu rằng Quang và Nina và mẹ của Quang có vượt qua được cơn sốc vì bị sập nhà hay không. Tất cả sẽ được hé lộ vào các tập tiếp theo. Các bạn hãy nhớ bấm vào đăng ký kênh để nhận được thông báo mới nhất về các tập phim sẽ được phát sóng hàng ngày trên kênh nha. Cảm ơn các bạn rất nhiều. Xin chào và hẹn gặp lại. Bye bye.